Right. As Nolan announced, today we'll talk about web design and specifically web typography. And my kind of just general background is I have about 20 years of experience, and I started as a CSS developer, and then I got into a lot of discussions with my interface designers and visual designers, graphic designers, who would develop their designs in Photoshop, and then when we translate that to web, it would just look awkward, and the font sizes were never matching. And I really started my career by taking screenshots of my websites and trying to find 10 differences between the Photoshop mockup and the final result. So this is kind of how I started getting into typography and got obsessed with typography, which eventually led me to participate in many very interesting projects, and pretty much kind of my whole career trajectory started with that. So what I wanted to talk about today is some differences between just general typography and readability and legibility, and how we can maybe push some boundaries of what we do right now. And said that, I think having the design skill to set legible text is, of course, an absolute must for any designer, not necessarily developer. Right? Even though I know a lot of developers who get to like typography because it's so exact, and it still gives you a lot of opportunity to be creative with it. But we as a design community have come a long way with web typography in general. Since the dawn of web design, we are moving away from Arial and Times New Roman. But I feel like we have allowed the lack of variety prior to the rise of web fonts to pretty much kind of dampen our creativity now that thousands and hundreds of thousands of web fonts are at our disposal through services such as Adobe fonts, Google fonts, Heffler & Co., and many independent providers such as Typotech, Commercial Type Font Bureau, Type Together, or Fourier Jones that you see on my screen. This is just some of the ones that I work with that have high quality fonts. But also I want to acknowledge that on this list, there's a lot of foundries missing who are designing non-Latin typefaces. And really, when you think about it, we have Chinese, Korean, Japanese kind of group of typefaces. We have Indic typefaces. We have Arabian scripts. We have a bunch of other type systems that are really just gaining traction right now. And then when you think about it, maybe a state in India would have 300,000 people who really don't have a way to print their text. So that become an issue when you have to have elections, for instance. So they pretty much kind of, sketch their flyers or forms and, distribute. So anyway, my whole point is that we have a wide variety of options, and it almost feels that we are still not utilizing much of that. And the question is, have usability conventions and the web's universality steered us away from proper art direction? As designers, we can achieve much more with type, and with just a little more thought and creativity, maybe we can finally start to take full advantage of the type systems. So let me talk about art direction. And I wanted to make one thing very clear, right? So this is a buzz from my home country called Croatia. And when I'm talking about art direction, this is not what I have in mind, right? And so, I can understand the comic sans that's on the top of the glass, right? Because strips are supposed to be fun, right? This is kind of a tour bus. And I can also understand this happy jumping dot and the dynamic logo that's set in italics, and it's kind of, have this kind of dynamic look and feel. And here comes the punchline, right? So what I really don't get is that dot behind the number 2043 in the phone number, right? In the last row. Can you see it? So there's a dot between the kind of two pairs of phone numbers, right? Which is definitely not something that you would just randomly put there. So I was wondering, ever since I took this photo, was this designer really kind of frustrated with the client, and that was their hidden kind of message that says, like, maybe you should take a pause before you dial this number? But anyway, so this is not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is really designs that utilize type in a contextually appropriate manner. So let me try to animate this guy. So, this is a New York Times article about the rise of skyscrapers in Manhattan, and it actually uses variable fonts to animate this bold heading to kind of, go up once you start loading the page. All subheads are done in the same way. By the time they come into the viewport, they would just animate, and you would see that kind of high-rise metaphor. And also, just as a heads up for today's talk, I won't be talking much about the variable fonts, but we can definitely cover it in the Q&A. I'll focus more on the kind of fundamental CSS stuff. All right, so there are plenty of examples of art-directed typography in print, and especially in mid-century graphic design, where materials were very limiting, and using multiple colors was expensive. Using photography was expensive because that required a lot of ink. And when you have so much material that you have to spend to print a batch of posters or books or magazines, it becomes very expensive. So in mid-century, graphic designers learned how to work around these limitations by utilizing some of the devices that were accessible to them. So these highly art-directed designs that use type and glyphs as visual elements are called typographics. And the term typographic stemmed really from the work of the famous American mid-century graphic designer and typographer, Herb Lubalin. There's a whole Herb Lubalin Center at Cooper Type in New York on the link on the side. I'll be able to share this slide deck after the talk, so you'll have access to all these links. But anyway, if you're in New York and you're close to Cooper Union University, there's a really nice basement area where you just have to send an email beforehand and go there, and it's a treasure trove of stuff like this, just a bunch of stuff. So you've probably seen some of the Herb Lubalin's designs for instance, for the Mother and Child and for the Spasm advert. They're featured in many roundup articles on clever graphic design or using type to for graphic purposes. And you can still find this kind of art direction in printed magazines, but creative use of type shouldn't be limited only to print, of course. So let's take a look at some ways we can push typographic design, at least on the web, to the next level. All right, so today's presentation will be split into two parts. So with this intro, I think I have about maybe max 40 minutes left. So I'll split it into two 20-minute long blocks. In the first part, I'll walk you through some simple techniques that can add variety and address some of the responsive web typography challenges, especially on mobile versus desktop, etc. And then in the second part, we can explore the Benton Modern brochure one-pager that uses only the Benton Modern fonts to present the font features, and the whole graphic design is only done with that same font that we are selling on that page. And this is a project that I collaborated with WebType a few years back, but this was really kind of a good showcase. All right, so you're probably aware of responsive web typography by now and how it can solve challenges outside of core responsive web design. Core responsive web design is pretty much responsive layouts, responsive images that would scale, right? But obviously, we want to be mindful about different screen sizes. And let me give you just a quick rundown of some of the methods we've developed in the last decades. And the ones that we also applied in the Benton Modern project that I'll showcase later. But also, these have been around for a very long time, but I still don't see like wide adoption, even though they're like really easy to implement into commercial projects even. So the first item I have today is providing different font sizes for different reading distances. So this means that the font size on a device closest to you can theoretically be smaller, right? Because it's close to you, and the font size on a device further away from you should be larger. So kind of that makes sense, right? And then in web design, in most cases, different font sizes are currently applied based on CSS media queries. CSS media queries basically help us detect screen size, aspect ratio, pixel density, and then based on that information, we hypothesize about how the device is used. So if the media query says like, oh, it's a small device, then we assume that it's a phone, right? So it's kind of, we give it like smaller font size. But long-term, this is probably not ideal because many new devices don't follow the assumption that smaller screens are closer to the user eyes than the larger ones. So one really good example is a car dashboard that might be small in screen size, but it's further away from your eyes, especially when it's in the central console or behind the wheel. So another example would be a queue screen in the pharmacy that practically uses the same principles of mobile design, like really getting rid of any layout, just having names for you can read your name when it's your turn to approach the counter, right? So one of the solutions is, of course, dynamic reading distance detection, for instance, with a web camera. But we'll have to wait until distance detection techniques become more feasible, especially because if you use the camera to capture someone's face and sort of kind of triangulate the distance, you get a lot of privacy issues, and it's just not practical right now. So, kind of until that happens, we'll still have to kind of eyeball it and really assume the best when we are setting the font sizes for different reading distances. And I can see that you guys are putting things in chat. So Bill, if you don't mind, just kind of keep note. And if there's anything interesting that we should address later, we can definitely do that.
I will do that.
All right, awesome. So in the meantime, what we can use is, for instance, size calculator. It's at sizecalc.com. This one is created by Nick Sherman and Chris Lewis, and these are really important people to highlight because they've done a bunch of tools like this, development tools, libraries, things like that. This tool is also really easy to use. It can help you wrap your head around the spatial variables that might influence your design decisions. But pretty much you can enter two values into into two or three boxes, and then you'll get the third one calculated for you. So each one of the values you change, they will update the third one. So that can kind of help you determine what is the ideal font size for your screen. All right, the number two is it's almost like a tip, right? So maintaining proportions in paragraph with appropriate letter spacing, word spacing, and line height. So you know that at different breakpoints or screen widths, right, we have different line lengths. So on a desktop, we can afford like full width paragraph, like the one you see as an example at the bottom. But then, on mobile screen, that space is really kind of shorter. So the line gets shorter as well. And, the opposite applies too. So like the shorter the line, the tighter line spacing has to be, because it almost feels that we by now trained everyone and their dog to space out the lines, especially on the kind of flexible full width page. But when you go tighter, you should also kind of reduce that density as well. And the reason for that is if you leave it like too spacious on mobile screen, you almost get an effect of like bulleted item list without bullets, right? So the space between lines gets so big that it almost feels that every line is its separate item. You don't get that kind of running text usability and design. Fonts, google.com/knowledge/ a lot of things. It's a new library for typography education. So by all means, go there. You'll have details about setting paragraphs and bulleted lists and all these nice things that are definitely outside of the scope of this talk. Another really useful thing is universaltypography.com/demo. This one was created by Tim Brown, who's a type director at Adobe Type. And he's a general, sort of like type, typography good person, even though they work at Adobe, they just occasionally spun out some of the kind of personal projects that are sometimes in line with Adobe strategy, sometimes they're not, but just a bunch of stuff on that same link that you can use. For this tool, what you can do, you can use sliders to reduce or increase the width of the screen, and then it will notify you. It will give you like green and red warnings when you're kind of going overboard. Pretty much kind of, again, you can use it as a learning tool or as a literal tool to grab code and put it into your project, and it will kind of provide you some comfort that your line length and spacing is appropriate. Right, so the next one is establishing hierarchy appropriate for the screen real estate. By screen real estate, I really mean like desktop versus mobile. We can use two things pretty much to establish hierarchy, right? So the first thing is using typographic scale or different font sizes for headings and subheads, for instance. And this is something that you would do on desktop. But on mobile, you will probably, using big size H1 would be just an overkill. So you want to keep it at approximately the same size. But instead of using bolds at 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, you can use different typographic styles. And I'll show you an example of that. So for that first case, for the desktop, for a huge screen hierarchy design, you can use something like modularscale.com. And what's really cool about this website is that drop-down that says ratios are pretty much musical scales. So anything that you select there will be automatically in harmony with one another. And then what you can see in the quick brown fox part is just different values. And then you can grab ems or pixels, but pretty much you can go with something like 16, 18, 21, 24, 36, 48, which is like very common scale and it's ubiquitous. Or maybe you can go with something that's more that has bigger contrast or slightly lower contrast between different values. So this is something that you would use on a desktop computer or desktop size for the website, for instance. And then high contrasting font sizes are great on desktop computers and large monitors, but on mobile, we might not have enough real estate. So the idea here is instead of setting titles and subheads at different sizes, we can use uppercase, for instance, for H2 or small caps style for H3 or italics for H4 subheads. And so that kind of allows you to have your paragraphs and lists at, let's say, 16 pixels, and then you can have, again, 16 pixels for H2, but all caps, and 16 pixels for H3 at small caps. You have this like subtle differences because the screen is very small, you don't get many of these subheads anyway at the same kind of view. So having these stylistic changes actually can save you a lot of space on mobile and just look better in general sense. So uppercase, small caps, italics are really kind of super easy go-to tools to style it on mobile. But there's plenty more options. And back, I think in 2013, we explored about 20 examples of different styling for subheads. And then some include lines and borders and layout shifts and just different positioning. But you can see on the right-hand side in the menu of that link, there's just like a lot of different options. So again, we don't necessarily have to stick with 16, 18, 21, 24, 36, 48, which is like super common. We can definitely add variety by just moving stuff around a little bit. And again, by all means, visit all these links and steal what you can steal. It's there for grabs. Number 4 would be, treating paragraphs in a different fashion. So, how books are like, they never have an empty space between two paragraphs, right? So everything's like really close together, especially because paper is expensive and you want to utilize it as much as you can. So what you see in books is pretty much when the paragraph starts, it would be indented, right? You wouldn't skip the line like we do on computers, pretty much, right? So again, this is another way you can save some space on the mobile screen. And then if you combine this idea for paragraphs with different ways to establish hierarchy for the subtitles, we get a number of variations that we can use to provide appropriate reading experience in different scenarios. And then the area separation that you see at the bottom row in this table is pretty much on mobile, you can separate different areas with white space. That's very convenient. But then when you have much more space, you can use lines or maybe textures, shapes, different color sections, et cetera, et cetera. Again, when you start using these types of things on mobile, you just waste a lot of real estate. And then you can even end up having, a little bit of like the top paragraph. And then because you have a border, you have to add extra white space. So kind of things become pretty funky at that point. Still not supported in many browsers, unfortunately, but this is what you see here is CSS Shapes. So the idea is that you would create a vector or path and specify it in CSS, and then the text would pretty much be wrapped by that path, right? And again, I'm looking forward to that one because we'd be able to then have these cutouts and maybe have photos that are not necessarily blocky and rectangular. In any case, if you want to be ahead of the curve, I would encourage you to take a look at the Sarah Sedan's blog, and she has a lot of SVG stuff, accessibility stuff, and she tries to kind of create demos for anything that comes out as even as a kind of just draft specification in CSS. But I'm really looking forward to something like this when it comes to layouts. Number 5, now we're getting into like a really geeky territory about fonts. This one is about graded fonts, right? And we can use graded fonts to normalize rendering across different pixel densities. And so let me explain what that really means. So if you take a look at this kind of bottom four rows, you will see that even though they have different weights, these are not really true bolds, right? These are not semi-bold or bold. And you can tell by the fact that the letters are the same font size, but really they, like on the right-hand side and left-hand side, they are matching. Like there's no change in the offset, right? So they're equal width, right? And so with bolds, what you would have, and this is very common, for instance, in interface design, you have this navigation that's perfectly like, that's tight and perfectly snug, right? You have 4 items in navigation. And then all of a sudden you say, hey, let me change it into bold when that page is active, and then it ruins your layout. So pretty much when you have difference between regular and bold is in that the bold would actually change the geometry of each letter. So the line would be longer. So you can see how these differences are really not changing any of the geometry of the line. They just change the appearance of the letter. And so they are invented, the font grades were invented because people needed a way to compensate for different ink and paper qualities, right? And now we can use it for different pixel densities. And as you already probably know, modern fonts are in the area of 300 dpi, which stands for dots per inch. Laptops are in the area of 200 dpi, and some office grade monitors are still sub 100 dpi. So we're talking about like, cubicle office type of thing, not necessarily, sysadmin office. But the idea of using grades in web design is explained in detail in that link that I have here, which is a blog entry by Oliver Eigenstein. Oliver is, by the way, one of the authors of IA Writer, one of the top 10 applications at App Store. And they really made that breakthrough with that application because it's solely focused on typography and this kind of writing experience. But anyway, long story short, lighter grades can be used for low DPI screens because low DPI screens have bigger pixels. It's more crude, so they would kind of make the appearance bolder. So you want to go with something lighter. And then with high DPI screens, which are more precise, you can go with heavier grades. And if we zoom in all the way to the pixel size level. So what you see on my screen is 1 pixel. I'm showing a single pixel with 3 subpixels, red, green, and blue. And many high handheld devices, but even desktop monitors can be rotated, which means that the subpixels will change orientation. And so again, graded fonts can also compensate for different subpixel direction between portrait and landscape mode. And again, not something that you have to necessarily include in your project, but I'm just giving you what's possible. Nothing really beats the live testing of the product you're developing. All right, so almost there with this first part. The number 6 is look for type families that have multiple optical sizes, and then of course use appropriate styles for small text, for instance, body copy, or display type, for instance, big headlines. And then this is Font Bureau's Benton Modern family. This is a screenshot of that website that I'll show you later. They make many families like this with a wide stylistic palette. And the concept here is basically using a low contrast version, like the one on the left, for small font sizes, and then high contrast version for expressive typesetting, the one that you see on the right. And when I say low contrast, I'm really referring to the contrast between thin and thick strokes in, let's say, letter R, right? So the letter R on the left is very crude and it's pretty much kind of uniform. You see some differences, right? But if you look at the one on the right, that one is much finer. And so even though the one on the right looks much more beautiful and appealing, imagine if you squeeze that to a really small size of 12 pixels, you would probably lose a lot of detail there, right? So that's why when we go into smaller sizes, we want to have something with less contrast between different strokes. When we go bigger, we want to be more elegant and have higher contrast. And then the last one in the series of basics, we can use different font widths to set type at different screen widths, right? So in this example, if you pay attention to the heading that reads the complete series, you will notice how the font width changes from condensed font on small screens to a wider font on larger desktop screens, right? And then to achieve this, in this particular case, we just loaded a different font at different breakpoints. Again, not many fonts have all these options available. So that's why when you see that a big font family, it's called font family, has a certain price tag on it, this is why. They have to create this whole system of just multiple fonts that will work at different sizes, different contrasts, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there's a tool for everything nowadays. You don't even have to manually set it. This is another project by Nick Sherman and Chris Lewis. Again, these guys from the beginning that created the size calc. They have a piece of JavaScript, and then you serve it a couple of versions of a couple of widths of the font. It can be only 2. And then the script will try to figure out which one to use for your specific width of the screen. And it works dynamically. You can resize the window. It will just kind of swap the fonts accordingly. And here's another little known fact. So popular fonts like Georgia and Verdana that you have on every computer nowadays are available in a commercial version, believe it or not, and they also have different font widths. So let's say that you have, excuse me, a commercial project and you have Georgia for body copy, right? You might want to consider adding Georgia narrow to the mix and maybe serve that for your mobile view, right? So let's say that you have a newspaper website, news website, and you have this like handcrafted articles, and Georgia is really good typeface for that. You're maybe using something like a narrower version of Georgia can make that text, use better, make better use of the available space of on the mobile screen. And of course, we have variable fonts that I mentioned that I won't discuss much. They're by now well supported. However, many variable fonts that are available still support relatively limited number of options. Usually in a variable font, what you'll find is the slant for the italic. So maybe they'll have a couple of steps that you can slant it more or less. They'll have a couple of options for the font weight. So you can make it, from light to first thin to light to regular to medium, bold, black, these types of things. But they very rarely have font width. So condensed, narrow, and wide, for instance. They rarely have show contrast like the one that I showed you with the fine details and then more crude letter R. And definitely they don't have the X height, which is very important for readability on small mobile phones. All right, so this is the first part done. I'm okay with having some questions answered. And if you need to take a break, this is a good time. We have about another 20 minutes for the second part. So how is everybody feeling about it?
This is great. We did have a question about small caps and how to get those to render using CSS on feature settings, SMCP. I don't know. I've never used that. Have you used that, Mark?
So I've actually, that was my question, and I've actually ran into issues with font feature setting on mobile in particular. It seems like there's some rendering issues between platforms. So I was wondering, like, what is the best way to render out small caps font outside of font feature settings?
Okay, yeah, that's a really great question. So I'll have a piece of code that you just described, but let me just kind of elaborate maybe a little in advance.
Yeah.
Usually the rendering issues stem from the absence of the actual small caps. So I don't know if you ever noticed or if you got to know the fact, but pretty much the regular and bold are the only fonts that you need to have in order for them to be rendered as they were designed. So even if you only have a regular and you specify in your CSS font weight bold, the browser will try to make it bold. So this is how you get this kind of faux bold versions, right? The same applies to italic, because bold and italic are pretty much so omnipresent that, let's say that you have just a regular Roman style for font and you put italic style on it, it will also be slanted. And this is something that type designers call oblique, right? Because it's not true italic. True italic has to have different curves, etc. But I'm sure you saw that before, right? And so the same applies to small caps. So if your font doesn't really contain small caps, and you apply font feature settings or for any other setting for that matter, the browser will try to kind of guess what you want it to do and will take the regular font and just make it smaller, which is horrible. Does that answer your question?
Is that true for all fonts? Because I thought OpenType had specific abilities to display small fonts or small caps.
Okay, so yeah, so that would be kind of my first debugging kind of sequence, checking if the font that I have actually has small caps, right?
Right.
And so another way you can approach it is also having a different font name specified, right? So maybe in your add font face, you can say something like, let's say Georgia small caps, right? Georgia small caps, you call it that way, you put in the quotes, right? And then you really don't specify it as small caps at all. You just load the font file that's actual small caps. And then through classes or something like that, you pretty much call that specific font name.
So separating out the small font or the small caps into a dedicated method of calling it.
Exactly. So it's almost like for all intents and purposes of that page, it's completely different font for that matter.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Thank you.
I think it's also important to note that you're probably not getting the OpenType font file through the web browser. You're getting the WOOF web open font format file, which is usually a subset of the characters. So you're not, because otherwise the font files will get quite large and become unwieldy to download. So
Right.
usually you're probably getting a subset of characters. So you have to either specifically make sure that the small caps are being included in that subset.
To be fair, this was something that I was trying to bundle into a React Native application. So I was definitely using the OpenType font. It just like there seems to be some rendering issues with OpenType fonts in React Native. And it's probably because I looked into this pretty far, and it seems like there's some rendering issues with specifically like the font features, like the additional font features in the Android platform itself, which is fun. But that's a good idea of just separating it out to a dedicated font. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, and maybe kind of as a last line of defense, if none of that works, and I know that this will be published, so I just want to make a disclaimer that I'm not encouraging people to do that. But usually, if you reduce the font to about 80 to 85% of the uppercase size, right? And use semi-bold, that would bring you pretty close to small caps. That's pretty much it, right? With small caps, additional thing that you want to probably add is maybe 0.05 m letter spacing so that you can space them out a little bit. I don't know if you guys ever noticed that the uppercase letters, especially when you set them as uppercase, they're too close to one another. And that's because they're not even designed to work that way, right? The uppercase letters are designed to work next to the lowercase letters. So when you use all caps, they're just too tight to one another. And so let's say that you use that hack of putting everything into uppercase and reducing to 85%. Pretty much you want to have the height of that fake small cap the same as the X height of the lowercase x, right? Whatever that size is, and then spacing it out a little bit so that it has a little bit more breathing room. So that would be kind of the last line of defense. But I know that if any type designer sees this, I'll be in trouble.
Yeah, I have a question. So I made a survey. So currently on my current class, I made a survey about like how should a website of my business look like, and I added Verdana, the font that you've previously shown, and all that stuff. So would that be a good idea to use as a font for a business?
Of course. I mean, IKEA uses Verdana, so I don't see why you can't use Verdana.
Yeah, and about font sizing, when we design websites, do I have to use EM or points?
So I think the points on the web really don't work, right? Because point is a physical size, and it's really difficult to translate it to pixels because computers work with pixels, right? So EMs are a completely different type of unit. So there are absolute units like points and pixels and characters, etc. But then you have percentages or Ms. Ms are pretty much multipliers. They're not real unit. So 1M will always render the same font size that was defined for the parent element. And I don't know if everybody knows about that, but by default, almost every browser will render 16 pixels as their kind of default font size. So when you start using 1M or 2Ms in your CSS, without doing anything else on the kind of root level, you'll get values like 16 pixels or 32 pixels. And it's easy to check that if you, for instance, just create a web page and go into your browser inspector and click the tab computed, which is computed value from CSS. Even though you put 1M in CSS, the computed value will be in pixels. And even if you choose not to use M's, but something else, the that tab computed value in the browser inspector will give you the actual pixel value. So even though we can use different units, it will all be just translated to pixels anyway. Am I making any sense?
Yeah. Thank you for informing me.
And I think using inspector is really like the best way to learn, especially if you're like wondering, hey, what's going on? I changed something and it didn't change the way I wanted. It didn't change the layout the way I wanted it. So like using inspector is really a good way to debug.
The other thing is that EM is the closest parent size, like based off of the closest parent size. There's also another font weight called REM, not font weight, I apologize, font unit size called REM, which is the root. I forget what EM stands for. But REM allows you to be able to have like combinations of pixel values and REM values without having to worry about breaking your EM values that are children.
That's correct. Yeah, REM always refers to the root size. But again, if you put the root size to something bigger, then the whole design will proportionally grow. If you put the root size to something smaller, then it will proportionally be reduced.
Right, which you don't want to do for accessibility purposes.
Exactly.
So when I do the font, so I have to also use the pixels in order to do the web designing?
No, you don't have to necessarily use pixels. You can use EMs or REMs or any other unit. But what I'm trying to say is that in your page in the browser, it will always be translated to pixels anyway. So just kind of keep that in mind, right? And sometimes it's easier to just specify things in pixels. Usually, as you get to design more and more websites, you start understanding that it's not about the actual metric value or pixel value, absolute value, that it's more about proportions. And so in that case, when you start using percentages and EMs, it's really easy to work with these kind of ratios and balances more than like specific elements that have to have specific rigid pixel value. It's just kind of more practical in a sense, but you can do either way. There's no limit.
Okay.
Right, everyone. Are you ready for the next part?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. Go.
Awesome. Right. So with this initial basic primer on responsive web typography out the way, let me walk you through the process of designing a web page that is meant to not only inform in a kind of usability sense, but also to amaze. And so WebType is a font bureau brand that commissioned a couple of designers, including Indra Kopschmidt and Nick Sherman and me. And so the brief was to showcase what could be done with a versatile type family using as many responsive techniques as possible. Literally, it was like, can you break the font? That was the brief, right? And so from the very start, we wanted to the user experience we wanted the user to experience the type family through examples incorporated into design. So the design would kind of showing instead of telling. We didn't want to use your typical, landing page with a call to action and, hey, buy this font because it's awesome. We really wanted to demonstrate what the font can do on the page. So in searching for the right metaphor, kind of use case for that font, we eventually settled on creating two distinctive designs because we couldn't really decide which one we want to go with. So we gave two to the client. And so the formal on the left and the expressive on the right are fully responsive. So both work on mobile screen. They utilize the same HTML even, right? So what you see in the top right, if you can see it on this small screen, is really a style switcher. So this is the same HTML in the fashion of CSS Zen Garden, if you ever heard of it. It has the same structure, same content, but we use different CSS to create two different versions. And then what you see here was an early stage prototype. The idea was to adopt a traditional newspaper column layout, which later evolved into what ended up being the formal version. And then with newspaper columns, it's all about utilizing available space because paper is expensive, ink is expensive. So text in newspapers is usually justified and also hyphenated. Hyphens are these little dashes that you see to break the words, right? If it weren't hyphenated, you would have a lot of weird spacing between words if you want to justify, and then vice versa, right? Usually justification or justified font, which means kind of straight from both ends, and hyphenation go hand in hand. And then once you kind of start moving these concepts to the web, of course, there are web design problems and issues and challenges and browser inconsistencies. So in our case, the columns were just too narrow to be justified and hyphenated correctly. So we just kept the hyphenation without justifying text to at least slightly improve the texture. So I hope you can see in the animation how it just looks better when we hyphenate. And when it comes to CSS, hyphens can be added with just simple CSS. And I'm using vendor prefixes over here just kind of for, I wanted to signal that that still has to be done. Of course, if you use something like a preprocessor, you might want to kind of add that into the workflow. But again, the hyphens are here combined with that text indent. So we would say that the first paragraph in the column shouldn't be indented, but the second one, any that follows the first one, should have the text indent so that we don't have to do that extra line, which would just break the layout and make it just out of place, I guess. So also another note on columns, because when you're reading newspapers, you hold the whole page in front of you, so you can go like up and down. And this is something that Bill talked about last time around when he was talking about the grid, CSS grid layouts. You want to kind of control what's going on. You don't want people to kind of have to scroll up and down. If they finish the one column, they need to go up, right? So we only use columns when there was enough horizontal and vertical space. And so that's why we introduced these multiple media queries to test the screen size before applying any columns. And again, if you want to check out that talk that Bill gave last time around, I believe Nolan already uploaded to YouTube, so definitely check it out.
Yeah,
right, so yeah, go ahead.
I just said, yes, the video's up there now if people want to check that out after we're done.
Yeah. If you don't mind, why don't you just paste it into chat so that people can bookmark it right away?
Sure, I'll do that right now.
All right, so the formal version was the first to be developed because we started with that newspaper layout, and we created this huge headline to reflect newspaper headlines and added the year that the series started, and the deck, which is a print term for the intro paragraph, the one that you see on the top left, was the obvious element to style next, and all this furniture that you see over there. And we were kind of pretty much happy with the top part. But then different sections down the page were a little dull, and especially the separation with only the white space in between these columns and the title, right? So after some trial and error, we decided to separate the different sections with dotted borders to further emphasize the fine detail in the design of the typeface, just adding a bunch of different characters from the font itself. Again, everything that you see here is in the font file. And obviously, by designing a website for a typeface, you have to become very intimate with everything that's available in the font. So we ended up using the section sign, that kind of double S, that's the section sign. And then the second one is mid dot. The third one is italic I for information, obviously, plus, and of course, the asterisk for pairing section. And then, some of these characters are rarely used in web design, so introducing them as decoration felt really like a nice touch so that people can be exposed to these new ideas. The next thing we wanted to showcase are a bunch of open type features included into the font, such as the alternate R, the ligatures, and the small caps. For instance, this Corbin, this is one font that actually has the true small caps. So I was absolutely sure that I can render that. And we didn't want to use any CSS images for graphic details. So we simply enlarged the type and brought the details to focus. Now let me just show you the difference between ligatures and default glyphs. So this is something that you would type in as FFFI. But if you apply the font and you apply the ligatures, and this is also something that you can apply through font feature settings in CSS, then the separate FF would be replaced with the ligature that you see in the first position. And so it's really important to understand, especially for people who don't really work with type much, is that if you apply ligatures, and the ligature will really behave as one letter. So it wouldn't kind of separate. Let's say that you want to all of a sudden space your title and add more tracking, which is space between letters. The FFFI would still stay as one letter. So, if you mean to track any of your letters in the future, just make sure that you disable the ligatures, because it will just look awkward, to have a couple of them kind of slapped together. And then, if you're wondering how to enable open type features, I definitely know Corbin knows how to do that. Here's a couple of examples along with vendor prefixes again, because as you probably know, not all browsers support CSS equally. Some older versions of Firefox require this Boolean, number 1 or 0 to kind of enable or disable. For the rest of them, you just have to specify the feature, and then this will be enabled for that browser. Okay, so believe it or not, I took vacation in the middle of the project, and I was chilling at a beach and flipping through some fashion magazines, and I started thinking about the project, of course, because default mode network, which is your subconscious, that's pretty much the creative force, always kicks in when you're doing something completely different. And so I started thinking about like, hey, what do we do with this, right? And because we were all happy with the formal newspaper inspired style, and even client approved that, and they were really happy with it. It was well organized with plenty of small details. But I had an itch to push design a little further. And so, how about creating a magazine inspired design? So this is how the expression version was born. In this version, we retain the same emphasis on elements as in the formal version, but we also fed the opening section with, and all the subheads with extra CSS pseudo elements. So pretty much you can add content with CSS. And so, yeah, I know it's not like technically, same HTML because we have some extra content, but, I like to think that these were just kind of decoration elements. So for instance, the kind of cover girl is this alternate R that you see here in pink. That's added as a pseudo element, and then the flower in her hair is another asterisk that was added as a pseudo element. But again, we were able to just use the font to create this kind of graphic style that's appealing and interesting to look at. So before we go into details, it's also important to remember that all the techniques that I'm about to show you should be treated as progressive enhancements, right? So they should work in responsive environment, on mobile, on desktop, on large screens. And creating something fresh and novel can be really inspiring, but we should always think about how it falls back in suboptimal environments or less generous screen sizes. So in the next couple of slides, I'll show you how to accomplish 3D effects, drop caps, flip type, and rotated type if you ever need that. So the 3D effect on the complete series style was achieved with, of course, multiple text shadows. Has nothing to do with 3D effect, right? But you can definitely use multiple text shadows for on the same element, a bunch of them, in fact. And this technique is well documented in Tim Brown's lesson using shades for eye-catching emphasis, and he's going into historical use of the shadows and all this kind of geeky stuff that I really like. But basically, you need to specify shadow for each pixel in both vertical and horizontal direction if you want to have different shades, right? But that's a lot of code to edit if you want to make a small adjustment. So let's say that you type this out and they're like, oh, wait a minute, I don't like it, right? I want to change the shade. And so people who know me like a little more intimately, they know that I'm a pretty lazy person. And I'm also very grateful for things like CSS preprocessors such as Sass, right? And so designers who can code, and I know there's a couple of you in the room, can really avoid a lot of manual labor and just write a Sass function to create whatever you need, and then once you have that function, you just call the function, change the values of the colors, change the distance that you want, and it's pretty much it's much more easier to tweak the colors and the offsets and all that stuff. Anyway, just wanted to encourage any designer and just give them permission to code if they need to. And if anybody tells you that you're a designer, not a coder, just tell them, talk to me. There, I said it. Anyway, the next item, drop caps. Drop caps can be achieved simply by floating the first character. There's a first letter pseudo selector there's a first letter selector in CSS by which you can target the first character in the paragraph. And you can definitely float it and make it bigger and red and all the stuff. But as you can imagine, this is not really well supported in across different browsers. So you just get it right in one browser, and then 3 of other ones are just messing it up. And again, as you can imagine, I was not the first person with the same problem. So luckily, folks at Adobe engineers wrote a dropcap.js to fix these inconsistencies. So the setup is very straightforward with that piece of JavaScript. It's easy to adjust positioning by pretty much specifying the number of lines that you want the drop cap to span, and also the number of lines that you want the drop cap to be. That doesn't sound right. So you can specify the height of the letter and then how many lines you want it to span. So the bottom piece of code that says drop caps 5,3 is 5 lines high, 3 lines span. Anyway, if you want to do that, if you have your personal blog, I think it's a really nice touch. And as a bonus for the script, it doesn't really require any external JavaScript libraries. And this is exactly the way I like it. I don't want to have, all these things loaded up just to, have one letter slightly bigger on the page. All right, so let's look at the letter O that has been rotated in this other subhead. So in fact, all elements such as this letter that need a special treatment were wrapped in their respective spans and given dedicated class names. And of course, this meant adding non-semantic markup, but there was really no other way around it. So especially if you wanted to take full control over the presentation. Right now, CSS cannot target specific letters. So you basically need to add extra code. I don't like it, but I think it was well worth it for this purpose. So yeah, with that span added, unassumingly called class is O, right, for the letter O in the bonus features. We just use the transform rotate to rotate it by 90 degrees. It's really not anything special. The only thing, if you want to rotate letters to create these special effects, you might want to also kind of tweak margins a little bit to space it correctly where it needs to be. Because again, even though the letter O seems like it's symmetrical, it actually is not. Almost every letter properly designed letter will be a little bit heavier at the bottom to just kind of simulate the gravity that our eyes are so used to. So yeah, just make sure that you tweak the spacing additionally. All right, the next one is flipped rows, right? Again, this one is also very easy to accomplish with the transform scale rule. Pretty much you can just apply whatever you want, whatever is the reflection that you want with this combination of ones and zeros. What's really cool about this technique is that even if the browser doesn't support it, nothing will happen. You'll just pretty much have the normal title. So I like these types of approaches where we add something, and if it's not supported, then nothing happens. Everything's accessible still, and still looks good, just not as good. All right, so now I want to show you how to create expressive typographic arrangements that are also responsive. If you remember, we wanted this to fit nicely into any screen size. So, on a small screen, we wanted to keep the same arrangement. And I have a couple of examples here, but this one was especially well done. I don't know if you can notice this kind of curve between the small t and the big T in the about and Benton, right? So there's a kind of spacing that pretty much follows the spacing between about and Benton words. So pretty much when we were designing with type and trying to do this kind of more typographic arrangement, we always try to find some opportunity to create some delight with that kind of spacing that pretty much penetrates into that curve as well. So this is the first example, but in the same category, we have the optical sizes and rates. Again, really kind of custom arrangement. There's this A crash course that also extends from that ampersand as well. So that was a nice kind of nook that we could put something in. And then the last one is how to use. Again, how to use is positioned in such a way that actually forms a question mark. But now the question is, how do we make them responsive? How do we keep the layout from falling apart once we start resizing the browser window, right? At just different sizes. And so pretty much we have to do only two things to accomplish that, right? So, and the first one is decide on the container and the topmost element in that arrangement, whether that's div class container or h1 even or something else or header, and you specify the font size in viewport with units, right? So that means that the font size will pretty much be reflective of the width of the screen, right? And then when you use ems, which are proportional, and it was funny that we had that conversation earlier, pretty much 1em will be reflective of whatever you specified in viewport width, and then as you resize, that m will just grow and shrink, right? And so when you specify everything in proportional units, it will just grow and shrink automatically altogether. So here's a piece of code. It's a little bit kind of longer, but basically all the elements inside the container can be repositioned either absolutely or with margins and these types of devices. And then if you're using absolute positioning, I think the best way to fix the aspect ratio of that whole arrangement is by using this padding technique. I don't know if you ever encountered that one, but basically when we say width 100%, we are setting a certain width, right, for the element. And then we say height 0. But then in order for us to maintain the aspect ratio, we can use padding, which will pretty much give us, 100% versus 75% is 4:3, 100% by 50% is 2:1. You can go with 56.25 for 16:9, and all these types of things. But pretty much you have that container H1 will retain the box, and however you squeeze it, it will just kind of automatically proportionally shrink. And again, when you use any child element that's specified in proportional units like percentages or ems, they will just again shrink together, and it will pretty much have the effect of a regular image, right? And so let me just show you this example. This is how different position methods work in a responsive environment. So one is done with ems, absolutely positioned, another one percentages, and the third one with margins. So pretty much retains the aspect ratio. All right, so I know that today we covered quite a few things, and I hope you learned something new. We covered reading distance, so pretty much detecting the size of it and maybe sizing that font size appropriately. I know that there's a lot of assumptions because we cannot really detect the distance. We talked about paragraphs and how we need to fix the line heights, the spacing between that, depending on the available space. We talked about different styles for mobile and that we have plenty of options. We don't have to use only the font sizing. We talked about paragraph spacing, so indenting instead of breaking the line, right? Graded fonts for these different screen resolutions or dots per inch situations. Optical sizes, again, low contrast for small size, high contrast for big size. Font weights, again, condensed, narrow, normal, wide for different screen resolutions. And then when it comes to art direction, 3D effects, drop caps, pretty much any type of positioning that we can imagine. And then also how to create scalable lockups. So again, once you design that, you can make it scalable. You lock it up and then it looks the same on every screen resolution. All right, so before I let you go, I wanted to share one last thought. Last thought. And as you have seen, setting type on the web still involves a lot of manual labor, especially for the smaller, kind of more delicate details. So sometimes back in 2005, believe it or not, we created a tool called Type Tester. It's still available and it's free to use. So we created it so that we can create these lockups in a kind of more of a what you see is what you get environment. And then the best part is that you can actually export HTML, CSS. I don't know if you see that button in the top left area where it will take you to another page and you can copy the piece of code that will pretty much contain all the stuff that I show you today for that kind of proportional lockup. So yeah, feel free to try it, and especially if you're new to expressive typography, it's completely free. So let me know. And then for me, what usually happens, let me just refocus this one. All right. What usually happens when I open Type Tester, I can easily get lost. I usually start by choosing an interesting ampersand or something specific that's very expressive like that. And then, try to move things around and see how everything kind of snaps and fits. I try to see the shapes from different angles. And then I might add a few innocent words, right? And sometimes if I'm lucky, and then my partner enters the room, I'll be like doing something like that. And she'll be like, oh, you're so romantic. And I think I consider that a win. So this is everything I have for you today. Thank you very much for listening.
That's fantastic. I love it.
This was great. Yeah.